Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences as well as its faculty and students. Today I'm joined by Dr. Boniface Fosu, an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Yes, I'm excited to have you on and talk about all the great work you do. But first I was hoping you could just introduce yourself, tell me about your professional experience and how you came to Mississippi State.
Well, I started my university education in West Africa in a country called Ghana, where I was born and raised. So I got a BSc in meteorology and climate science. And after my BSc, I came to the United States for graduate school and went to Utah State University, where I graduated with both a master's and a PhD in climate science. So from Utah State University, I did a 2-year postdoc at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Sure.
And then went to Columbia University for another year. And in January 2022, I started here as an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences with a joint appointment at the Northern Gulf Institute.
Sure, yeah, and we're so excited that you could make your way all the way here to Mississippi State, and yeah, you've got a couple of different positions, but the Geosciences department is a thriving department, and so we're so excited that you could join. And so just to start, could you tell me what is your research expertise and what kinds of information are you trying to discover?
Right, so my research expertise and interest lie at the intersection of climate science, climate change, and extreme events. So I focus on understanding the mechanisms or what drives these extreme events. So I use a plethora of observational data sets and empirical techniques, and I also use climate models in these endeavors. What is exciting and one strand of the research I do using climate models is basically deconstructing the climate system. So we can go into the climate model and turn on or turn off important aspects of the climate system. And by doing that, we are able to characterize how extreme events are able to respond to these changes in the climate system.
Sure.
So currently, we are working on a research, newly funded research by the Gulf Research Program of the National Academy of Sciences, which is aimed at looking at how tropical cyclones or hurricanes will change in the future. And so not just the tropical cyclone occurrence, but their characteristics and the hazards that come with them. So we are looking at storm surge, we are looking at precipitation and flooding, we are looking at all the high winds and how they will change in the future, and then how those changes will impact petrochemical spills in the Gulf region and their subsequent health implications. So I'm really excited about that.
Sure, yeah, you're taking a look at these extreme climate events using advanced equipment to kind of get at the heart of how do they happen, how will they get worse in the future, and then also how to prepare for these advanced extreme weather events. And also some of your research focuses on how do these bigger climate factors affect local weather. And so that's one reason I wanted to have you on, because it just seems like we've been getting a lot of crazy weather recently. There was hail in the spring, the summer has been extremely hot, and just from what I understand, it's connected to El Niño. So could you tell us what exactly is El Niño and how does it affect weather here in Mississippi and across the country?
Well, the El Niño is one of the most important phenomena on Earth, a climate phenomenon on Earth. And an El Niño is a climate pattern that is characterized by warmer than average ocean waters in the tropical Pacific. And it's very important because it has an outsized impact on weather and climate worldwide. Not just weather and climate, but also on marine life. other stuff. So the opposite of an El Nino would be a La Nina, where you have below average ocean waters in the tropical Pacific. And generally, you have the opposite effect to what you would have when you have an El Nino. And together, we call the phenomena the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So when you hear ENSO, it's not just El Nino, but it also encompasses La Nina.
Okay.
Now, in the last couple of years, last 2 to 3 years, we've had a La Nina in the tropical Pacific. What usually that means for the United States is that you have warmer and drier than average weather climate conditions in the southern United States, and the opposite in the northern United States and Canada. And then you have the opposite happening during an El Nino. So you have warmer than average and drier conditions in the north during an El Nino, and then cooler and then wetter conditions in the southern United States, including Mississippi.
Sure.
Now, in terms of hail, like I led with, the last few years have been a La Nina.
Okay.
And then the research on hail is not settled, but preliminary, the preliminary results points to having more hail activity during in the springs after following La Ninas. So that might be able to explain the hail activity we had in the spring.
Right.
We are just beginning to see a weak to moderate El Nino develop in the Pacific, so we are really excited about that.
Sure.
And that has a lot of implications for the this winter and then the subsequent spring as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think El Nino is something that a lot of people learn about in grade school. You know, I knew that it was hotter weather, but I think something that people don't think about is how big of an impact it has. You know, so wherever you are, you think you know the local weather, but it's all connected. The larger climate factors kind of impact your local weather, and so that's the kind of stuff that you research, and you can see how it's all connected. So I find that so fascinating and super relevant in our day and age. And so another question I had is, how, in what other ways might bigger climate factors impact local weather in ways that people might not think about?
Right. Well, so you mentioned the global impact of, you know, El Nino, and sometimes it can sound a little, abstract, you know, when you think about it. But you can, an analogy that I would usually use is think about dropping a big rock in a pond. You see the ripples,
Right.
and then you see them travel for a distance. That's how it works. So you have this huge area of convection and warmer than average ocean temperatures, or below below cooler than average ocean temperatures in the Pacific, and that the rippling effect is what we feel. Now, there's so many other ways that El Nino and La Nina can impact local weather here. So I'll start with tropical cyclones or hurricanes.
Sure.
So when there is an El Nino in the tropical Pacific, hurricane activity tends to be, we tend to have fewer than normal hurricanes in the Atlantic basin. So due to higher wind shear. So we tend to have that. And then when there is a La Nina, the opposite effect happens. So it means that tropical cyclones or hurricanes will still happen, but just the large scale conditions are more favorable to, in this case, with an El Nino developing, are more favorable to having less cyclones develop. And then there is tornado activity. During El Ninos, we tend to have suppressed tornado activity versus when we do have La Ninas. And then the impacts also include wildfires. I mean, here in Mississippi, there aren't a lot of wildfires, but they still do happen. And then when we have El Ninos, we tend to see fewer of them than when we have La Nina. So these are some other ways that El Nino impacts the local weather and climate. And even for tropical cyclones, they may not, for places like Starkville, they may not reach the direct impact of tropical cyclones making landfall, may not be felt here, but the remnants of tropical cyclones are felt, farther inland, and then they also do spawn tornadoes even in their wake. So
Sure.
these are, in general, ways in which the El Nino Southern Oscillation can impact local weather.
Yeah. I think, an average person might be like, the hurricanes were so bad this year, or they weren't so bad this summer, and why is that? And it might seem kind of random, but your research can kind of pinpoint why certain extreme weather events are happening and why they aren't. And you can connect them to the bigger climate factors going on. And so that's such important work to do. We've seen in the past recent years there is extreme weather and there's massive destruction that can happen from that. And so it's important that someone's doing that research. And so the last question I wanted to ask you is, how do you hope that your research can help mitigate the impact of these extreme weather events?
Right. So ultimately, we do this to eventually save lives. Trying to understand the mechanisms of extremes, especially with in the current climate dispensation where we are talking about climate change, is really important because understanding the mechanisms will help us better predict and project them. And people in higher places, policymakers, they tend to pay more attention, and all of us really pay more attention to extreme events because the impacts are readily felt. So I hope that the outcome from the research we are doing here can help drive policy, help around mitigation and adaptation and how to better prepare and deal with extreme weather and climate events.
Sure. Yeah, in order to avoid the worst of the extreme weather, we have to know that it's coming.
Right.
And then also your research shows that it's getting worse, or it might be particularly bad one year. And so it's important that policymakers have that information and can make the most well-informed decisions using
Right.
it. So that is also fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking about your research. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.